There, great. So what we're going to do, hopefully in this little under an hour, is introduce you to all of these topics and give you an overview. And so without too much further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Steven Spielberg. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Charmaine. So I'm just going to start by defining what affordable housing is. When people hear the term affordable housing, I think a lot of different things come to mind for a lot of different people. And in the industry, while not exact definition for everyone, it's a little more straightforward. So when we talk about affordable housing in the affordable housing industry, we typically mean deed restricted rental housing at area median incomes at least below 60% AMI, AMI being area median income. And typically it's a range of incomes between 30 and 60% of area median income. So we thought it would be helpful, since most of us are in LA County, to define really what exactly does that mean. And so the numbers we're looking at in front of us are from 2020. The 2021 numbers just came out, so they're pretty close. And in 2020, the average area median income for all of Los Angeles County was $78,900 for a one-person household. And it increases per person, so 2 people in a household, 3 persons, and so on and so forth. And so when we talk about renting to people that make between 30 and 60% of the area median income, that means between 23,000 and 47,000 in LA. And oftentimes we hear terms like low income, extremely low income, very low income, and those are actually defined. And so extremely low income would be the 30% AMI people, and low income typically is up to 60% of median income, sometimes up to 80, but we'll stick with the 60 for today. And we included a chart, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, to give you an idea of what those rents are, which are set at 30% of the incomes you see up there. So this can actually all be done with math. If you took that 78,900 median income and multiplied that by 30%, that would be the 30% of area median income, $23,000 a year. And people typically pay 30% of their income. So that number divided by 12 for 12 months of the year at 30% of that gives you that studio rent of $591 and up to $1,183 for the 60% AMI rent. Next slide, please.
Okay, so it's Mo Mohana who's coming up next.
Thank you, Charmaine, and hello. Thank you for giving us the time to be with you here today. We're very excited. I think Fernando probably summed it best when he said, you have a great site that's on Main Street, that's zoned, it's per the general plan amendment, and you have all the political support as well as the neighborhood support. What is wrong with you, the affordable housing developers? Come on, you should be standing in line. And herein lie the challenges. The where, what, and who. A site that is a great site in the eyes of a city or in the eyes of a seller or in the eyes of a market rate developer may not be a site that would work for an affordable housing project. There are, to start with at the very top level, because all of these use some form of low-income housing tax credit, there's something called a Qualified Allocation Plan, a QAP. The QAP by the Tax Credit Allocation Committee changes from year to year, sometimes small changes, sometimes big changes. But in that, it dictates and drives where they want the housing to be. You could see qualified census tracts, DDAs, transit-oriented, highest resource, but then there's service amenities. And those service amenities require us to score. We have to be within certain distances of certain amenities, library, pharmacy, so on and so forth. And it's specific. You have to be within a quarter mile of certain distances. If you're within 0.27, you don't score. What's wrong if you don't score from 0.25 to 0.27 is if you don't have a complete perfect score and you're competing at the ratio tiebreaker level because everything is oversubscribed, don't bother submitting the application. Hence, the where is dictated by other factors. And I did mention the QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan, but there are other state funding sources that are coming into play now that have their own drivers of where they want to allocate those projects, and they don't always line up. So when you think through this presentation of what the different sources we have to go to and the different programs we have to go to, and the fact that they don't align, that is part of the biggest challenge in affordable housing. It's not streamlined at the whole state level, from the state to the county to the city, and so on and so forth. The interesting is the what. And you look at it, construction standard, unit sizes, common areas. Wait a minute, that's in the zoning. Many cities have minimum square footage. Many cities have in their building codes, construction standards and designs and so on and so forth. Well, again, the state agencies, whether the tax credit allocation agencies, the bond allocating agencies, or the state funding program, have decided to create their own construction standards, their own minimum unit sizes, their own requirement as to how many washers and dryers per unit, whether it's family or senior. All of that affects the design that we can do, the product that we produce, as well as the cost. And that's something that you will hear further down in this introduction, the cost. So it's not just about finding the sources that will help us close the gap on these affordable housing communities, but it's about the cost. The more we push the cost, the less effectively we have funding sources, something to keep in mind. The last item defined again by the QAP and the other funding programs is the who. Who are we targeting? Is it families? Is it senior, formerly homeless, mental illness? Pre-2008, the direction was really general workforce, family, affordable family, and senior. As the years have changed, we have found a much stronger concentration on special needs, on homeless. That changes the dynamics significantly, because when you start driving into the homeless or the special needs, now you're driving into the need for project-based vouchers. When you're driving towards the other example of families and seniors, independent living, workforce, there is no ongoing rental subsidy, hence no Section 8, so a significant driver. So if the program is driving it that way and the city or that specific county does not have enough vouchers, then it doesn't work. Next slide, please. So the 101 of tax credits, and we will get into that in more depth. There are 4% tax credits and 9% tax credits. 4% tax credits go with tax exempt bonds that are issued by the Debt Limitation Allocation Committee. And 9% credits are typically coupled with conventional financing. Tax credits are absolutely critical because typically they provide most of the capital stack that is needed. It is unique from market rate equity in the sense that it does not need to be paid back. So when a simple example of a $30, $40 million project and you have close to $10, $20 million of equity, that's money that does not have a debt service, does not have to have payments against it, does not have to have cash flow being swept against it, and does not need to be repaid. The tax credit investor receives the benefit over 10 years. The tax credit investor must stay in the partnership for a 15-year minimum period. And through the depreciation and losses and the tax credits, they receive the benefits that they need, hence no repayment. A very unique and very valuable component that without affordable housing as we know it today would not be. And this low-income housing tax credit program, you will see later on in the slides, how many units it's responsible to make happen and make developed. The structure, hence, is rather unique for affordable housing. And many say, wait a minute, you're the developer, you're the operator, we're counting on you, but you're only a 0.01% partner, MGP? Yes, because the more we can allocate to what's called the tax credit investor, the limited partner, then if I have $100 of tax credits, then 99.99 can be sold. Hence, a unique partnership structure that in itself causes a lot of limitations and restrictions. As we will see further on, the investors and the lenders really weigh in heavily themselves also on how it's structured and what they want to see in their own eyes as design and as standards. A typical example, and we will get more specific examples, is that the developer is awarded 1 million in annual federal credits, and the word annual is used. So typically that translates, as I mentioned, 10 years. So that's 10 million of federal credits. The investor purchases 99.9%. If we're lucky enough, and the credits have changed, the pricing goes up and down, differs per market, differs per developer, differs per product type. These days, actually, the average has now dropped below 90 cents. Then the project receives $9 million of tax credit equity. And then the investor, tax credit investor, receives 99.99% over the 10 years. And that in general is the basic structure. You will see from upcoming slides that it is much more complex than that. Many other sources are needed today in order to have a capital stack that covers the total cost. And there comes in the complexity, the timing, and the ability to try to coordinate all of these items. And I'll hand off back to Charmaine. Thank you.
Oh, next. Funding. Next slide, please. So I thought you were going to do this one, Mo, but that's okay.
No problem. I'll continue right on.
Okay.
So public debt, grants, and loans. We discussed debt. Debt we have, if it's tax-exempt bonds or conventional financing, at the end of the day, we are going to an institutional lender to get either or. One is in the form of tax-exempt bonds. They're either private offerings or public offerings. And those typically are coupled with what we know as 4% tax credits. The conventional financing comes typically along with 9% credits. And in both cases, obviously, those are permanent sources, but we need construction funding for the construction period. And the construction period typically sees a significantly smaller amount of tax credit equity. The tax credit equity investor really does not want to take the bulk of the construction risk or the lease-up risk. So the amount coming in from equity is significantly lower, typically 50% max by construction completion. But the construction lender is truly the party that is taking most risk. Public funding sources and multiple sources, as you are going to see, come from local cities, come from counties, come from states. They are competitive and they are limited. And those are the ones that we spoke about earlier, dictate the population. You know, the state program will target a certain population. The city program may target a certain population. And that becomes the difficult part for a developer that wants to put together affordable housing, is how do I line up what everybody wants to see? So it's really, I have a square hole, but the peg is different. One wants to give me a triangular peg, one wants to give me a circular peg, and some way, somehow, it needs to fit everyone's needs. At all these programs are oversubscribed, and the key is we have to be competitive. To be competitive, there are minimum threshold requirements for scoring, and most of them, because they're oversubscribed, these days at the state level for tax-exempt bonds, as well as state credits that are available, it is the lowest ask. And that the only way you can compete on the lowest ask, as I go back and you'll see us focus over and over on that, is cost, because you can't just artificially reduce your ask. You'll have a gap unless we reduce the cost. Examples that are very well known out there in LA County and obviously City of LA our Measure HHH funds that the city of LA has issued about $1 billion and is a direct driver for a significant number of veteran and homeless housing being driven. City of LA, County of LA also has several other sources. State sources, typically from HCD, Housing and Community Development, as well as CalAID, are two very important sources that we focus on. And these programs cover veterans, have specific requirements for design, and cover different populations. Public sources also are typically residual receipt loans, meaning paid out of available cash flow. So once the operating expenses are paid, the debt service is paid, there are certain fees that have to be paid to the tax credit investor and the managing general partner. Then we take what's left and of what we call the available cash flow. And if you have multiple sources, it gets very interesting. If I have 4 different soft funding sources and every one of them wants to sweep 50% of the cash flow, mathematically it's 200%. And there comes the juggling on who's going to sweep what percentage, who gets what priority, and again, all those complexities. Last but not least, I will leave you with this thought when aligning things and understanding how it complicates them. The first slide that you saw that Steven Spielberg showed you rents. Those rents are published by TCAC. They are based, a tax credit allocation committee. They are based on HUD incomes. And we said simple math, 30 and 60%. However, just in that alone, that California Health and Safety Code calculation of those rents, while they agree on income, because it's published, differs than that of the Tax Credit Allocation Committee. Tax Credit Allocation Committee takes the income and uses the bedroom count and uses a 1.5 person per bedroom. California Health and Safety uses a 1 person per bedroom. And therefore, the rent at the end of the day is not lined up and causes significant complications for the lender, investor, as well as the developer. How do you solve that? Lots of Advil, and we'll cover that later. I'll hand it back to you, Charmaine.
Okay, next slide, please. And now we're going to be joined by Steven Pontal, who will talk about Fast Facts.
Yeah, hello, everybody. And I do apologize. I believe I'm on the wrong side of the digital divide, so I'm not going to turn my camera on, which is probably a benefit for a lot of people. What I wanted to do is very quickly set a little bit of the context. Now that you've heard some of the challenges that we're facing, if you take a look at this slide and you look at, so how many units are produced using the primary tools that we have in the state of California? And on average, it's about 20,000 units a year statewide, using both the 4% and 9% tax credits, which are primarily leveraged by private debt and local sources. And so if you think about 20,000 units a year statewide, and then you think about, we need about 500,000 housing units to meet the SCAG RHNA requirements. And if you think about we're 60% of the state, and so you can begin to think about the significant gap in the sources of funding versus the need we have. And if you think about what's considered a huge success, and it was, which is Project Homekey, creating 6,500 units through motel acquisition and conversion, that's 6,500 units to house 150,000 homeless. So even the most successful homeless initiative we have underway right now is still statistically insignificant. So a little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about how to bend the cost curve, because the more money we put on with the costs going up the way they are, is the hole is going to get deeper and deeper. So hopefully that doesn't scare you too much, but creates a sense of urgency about what we're doing now is not going to work. We need to work as partners in order to figure out solutions. Thank you, Charmaine.
Thank you, Steven. And I think urgency is exactly the right word. 76,000 units for the gateway cities under the new RHNA. That's pretty urgent. So next slide, please. we're going to go back to Steven Spielberg, who's now going to give us a little bit of information on the timing of affordable housing.
Thanks, Charmaine. So we just wanted everyone to understand how an affordable housing project comes together time-wise. And each project's a little bit different. And as the last few speakers noted on the different financing that comes in, that is one of the biggest drivers of what takes affordable housing so long, because we're compiling different sources. And so this example project is called the Point on Vermont. We first conceived of the project in the summer of 2016. And as you'll see from the timeline there, we actually completed it about a month ago. So on the next slide, you'll see a picture of the completed building. I think what you will notice is that affordable housing tends to be really good looking housing and can often not only be indistinguishable from a market rate project, but sometimes some of the best looking product in the neighborhood. But it does take a while, and it's good when people understand that, because you will hear things right now in the city of LA that they're looking at trying to take back HHH funding that's not been used. But as we go through this timeline, you'll see that it's not always so easy to get an affordable housing project off the ground as fast as someone might think. So as you can see from this project, we initially conceived this as family affordable housing, but we were denied funding from the city of LA. We came back to the city of LA in their first round of HHH funding as a 100% homeless project. And we again run into troubles because politically and the neighborhood in general wasn't interested in a 100% homeless project. So we went back to the drawing board again. We did community outreach, we did political outreach, and we arrived at a solution that was 50% of the units for formerly homeless, 50% for low income. We gave the community a retail space. We gave the community a recording studio for low income youth. We gave the community a community room. Typically, community rooms are only for the residents. We're providing a room that the community in the surrounding area can actually use. And that got the community and political acceptance we needed to get our HHH award. But then we needed several other sources. And we were actually fortunate in this case that we were able to get through LA County and City, because as Mo mentioned earlier, oftentimes now it's going to the state, which is an additional process. Once we were able to line all of that up, we were able to go after tax credits. That takes a couple of months to find out if you were awarded. And then once awarded, it takes about 6 months before you can begin construction. And hence the 3-year timeline to get to construction, and then about 1.5 years of construction. So if you could go to the next slide, please.
Before we go, Stephen, I want to interject. This is Mo. Let me get my video back on. Sorry. On the retail component, and I think this is very important for the cities to know and realize. And we understand that it is in the zoning. However, you may not finance any retail space with tax credits. The lender will underwrite the retail space, no matter where you are, at 0 income. And many of the other funding programs are specific in that you cannot use those funds to develop, to pay for the cost of the retail. So the retail, while it is a zoning item desired, is an absolute negative and burden that encumbers affordable housing and requires the developer to really forego other sources, forego other things that can be put there, but no source funds it at all. And I know, again, it's great from an urban design, it's great from a zoning perspective, but we need to focus on what is important and what takes away. So bending the curve is not just cost, it's also zoning requirements that negatively impact financing. Thank you.
Thanks, Mo. Very well said. And I think that is something that a lot of cities look at and they say, oh, affordable housing, and we're going to be giving money for that, so we should also get something more than just affordable housing out of the deal. and they impose a lot of different things. As I mentioned, 3 or 4 different things on the ground floor of this project, and it makes it very difficult, both from a financial perspective, but then also most of us affordable housing developers, we're nonprofits or sometimes for-profits, and our business is affordable housing, not running very small retail operations. And typically, if retailers want to go to a neighborhood, they know about it and they go for it. So often in affordable housing, it means sometimes a vacant space that we had a very difficult time renting out in the bottom of our affordable housing project. And quickly, I want to jump into this next slide, which really takes into account all of the effects which you just saw. So you'll see the picture. This is the completed picture of the project you just saw under construction. It turned out looking great. As I mentioned, most of the sources for that project came from City of LA, but these days, typically most projects need to go for more sources and probably need to go to the state. Right now, the state, HCD, Housing and Community Development of the state of California, they have about 6 or so different sources we use regularly, and they're often well oversubscribed. So you really have about a 20% shot of actually getting funded. They only have 1 or 2 rounds per year. And so that means if you don't get funded when you first apply, you're likely to have to come back and maybe even come back again. The rules often change at least every time they come out with a new round of funding. And as you might guess, this has effects beyond delaying the housing from starting construction. Our land costs go way up. We often acquire the site when we first identify it. So there might be 3-4 years of acquisition loan interest. Construction costs can go way up. Building codes change, and then on occasion, we might actually lose one of our sources that said you must start construction within a certain amount of time in order to get our funding. So with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide and turn it over to David Grunwald, who's going to tell us a little bit about community outreach, services, and some common misconceptions about affordable housing.
Thanks, Stephen. So building on the Vermont project that EH has done and many other projects that us affordable housing developers do, you can have a by right affordable housing project and not be required to go through any zoning or entitlement significant efforts. However, if you want to get your project done, you have to do community and political outreach in a substantial fashion. And you can see from Stephen's example, they started with one approach with a certain group of people to provide housing and assistance to, and that changed because the community had a different approach. So to develop that approach, to get community support, to get local political support, we do extensive outreach. We have workshops, open houses. We describe to the neighbors what our development will be, what our architecture and design will be. We ask for feedback and input. And the goal is really to develop community support, as well as working with local leaders and housing advocates to get support for what we're trying to develop. And as Mo was saying earlier, there's been a dramatic shift in funding source identification of residents in a shift to special needs. Many communities have fear and trepidation about housing homeless and other folks with special needs. But surprisingly, in some communities, as we're noticing, if homeless folks are actually given housing and encampments are removed, community support occurs. The best example of that's Project Home Key, where encampments are being shut down and folks are being moved into existing motels. And getting local support for that, which are future development projects, and existing new construction projects is critical to the success of any project. It does not matter if they're by right. You can't get local support, you can't get local funding support if you don't do that outreach. And some funding sources, like the cap and trade money through the ASIC program, requires extensive outreach. Next slide. So one of the reasons why affordable housing does improve the communities they're in and improve the lives of the residents is that depending upon the acuity level of the residents, there's comprehensive social services. And so, for example, in a special needs project that provides housing to formerly homeless folks or folks with significant mental health issues, on-site social services, mental health services, case management services are provided to help those individuals thrive. And for basic affordable housing, even basic affordable housing, social services are a component, and those services can range anything from, financial literacy courses to after-school programs. Whatever the needs of the constituents are in those affordable housing communities, social services can be linked. And that goes a long way into meeting the community's need of how do you stabilize these affordable housing communities. So our organization, National Core, and other developers that are part of this panel either have their own social service programs, or they partner with other social service programs throughout the region who provide specialized support for residences. So these are not just communities that don't have the support they need. They are all supported with comprehensive services. Next slide. So affordable housing myths. I think what we've just discussed about providing social services, the type, the design, the architecture. You saw the Vermont program that Vermont Community EH has done. Affordable housing looks just like market rate housing, and in some cases might even be more significant architecturally and design wise. And so there's a big myth that affordable housing, especially new construction, diminishes property values. It's just the opposite. You can see in communities where new affordable housing has been built, it either elevates the property values around the area or encourages more development given the architecture and design. It also reduces crime in these neighborhoods because it actually houses people who might be more prone to not be the best community members, and it provides them with the social services they need to address some of their issues. And now future affordable housing developments also reduce the amount of traffic because many of them are unparked. The state's, again, cap and trade program that provides for dense housing eliminates the need for parking of residents. And most of the communities we design complement the communities they're in. They take into account the local architecture. They take into account what the density is, what the type and style of residential communities they are, so that they complement the communities. And in many cases, once affordable housing communities are developed, the neighbors become good neighbors. Us developers and operators are good neighbors, and we fit nicely within communities because we take into account their needs. And I think, who is next? Is it Eric? I think Eric's next. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, David. As Charmaine mentioned earlier, I'm an architect, and so I'm really happy to be able to complement this presentation by showing you this case study done with Mercy Housing through the lens of an architect. And I'm going to explain what we were able to do bending to all the criteria that we've spent the last 45 minutes talking about. This project includes a lot of those things, and how we were able to solve some of those problems and create a quality living environment. This project is in city of Placentia. It is not a high profile urban infill location where we need to fit in. It's actually the opposite. It's a location where we're creating our own environment. We're creating our own placemaking so that we're essentially creating a wonderful place to live out of nothing. And so this site is south of Orangethorpe Avenue and a railroad track, and north of a drainage canal, and in between two dumps, literally trash dumps. And luckily it's a big enough site that we had some room to do things, to create some open space and make that quality environment. I don't know if it's possible to zoom in a little bit on the site plan. This gives a great view of the context, but then if we are able to zoom in, you can see some of the niceties of the site plan. This is 50 one-bedroom units for formerly homeless veterans, and Mercy teamed up with New Directions to provide those supportive services. New Directions specializes in services for veterans. One of the things that we were able to do architecturally, because the site was big enough, is to single load this building. And what that means is that there's a corridor with living units only on one side. And we use that corridor to act as a sound buffer to mitigate the acoustics coming from the railroad, which occasionally can, as you all know, create quite a bit of sound. But that was very successful by creating that dead air and in that corridor, and 2 layers of wall assembly would create a really nice quiet living environment. This is a LEED Gold project as required by some of the financing sources, and has enough site that we can have community gardens and walkways and a really nice outdoor patio for people to gather. Next slide, please. A little bit on the business side. I mentioned architecturally, there's a lot of constraints, and as the panelists have been saying, those constraints, those funding sources come with a lot of requirements. This was actually the brainchild of Damian Arula at the city of Placentia. Used to be at the city of El Monte. He and Mercy were talking and said, we have this site located. Let's figure out how to provide housing for formerly homeless veterans. And so this is a cooperative project between the city, the county, U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, lenders, and private lenders, as well as the nonprofit Mercy. And some of the financing sources were tax credits, county funds, combined with the conventional mortgage and the Prop 41 Veterans Housing Bond from 2014, all working with HUD VASH vouchers to make it possible for these folks to live there. What's really exciting architecturally is that you notice from some of these pictures, it's a really beautiful environment. City of Placentia really wanted craftsmen. They thought that it looks like housing. It has a quality, friendly feeling. We're able to have, because of the single loaded corridor that I mentioned, we're able to have ground floor patios and balconies looking out on this wonderful green belt. The landscape architect was clever. They called it the meadow in between the drainage canal, which I called the stream to the south, but linking ground floor patios and community patios with fire pits, with community gardens, and created a really wonderful living environment that we're proud to be a part of. And also one last thing to mention is that architecturally, we didn't have a lot to work with, but we were really happy that we were able to come up with one unit plan that stacked 3 stories high, repeated over and over again. We're able to do it in a non-rated 3-story wood frame building, slab on grade, very economical, and worked with the allowable zoning constraints to do that. And it's really important to for us to be able to do our part to help make the whole thing pencil that way. So thanks for letting me share this one.
Okay. Next slide is Marv's Place, and back to David.
Thank you. So Marv's Place is an example of everything we discussed in terms of outreach, social services, and complex stacking of funding sources. As you can see, it's a Spanish style, Spanish style design in Pasadena. It complements the local architecture. It's for 20 families that were, suffering from homelessness. We partner with an outstanding organization, Union Station. They provide comprehensive services to our residents. They help parents in these families find jobs and continue their education. They provide after-school assistance to their kids and support and access to healthcare, mental health assistance, a broad range of services, with the hope that these families move on to more permanent housing situations and can afford to, grow and support their families. Comprehensive outreach was done with Union Station and National Core to ensure not only design, but that the programming and supportive services met the needs of the resident. We received nothing but support from the local community. Marv's Place is a model in terms of PSH for homeless families. And again, you could see the design is complementary to, Spanish style in Pasadena, as well as taking into account neighborhood concerns. Next slide. I think it's Steve.
Actually, I was going to do this slide, but if Stephen wants to do it, that's fine too.
Sorry. I think it's you, Sherman.
That's all right. This is just, I'm going to do this rather quickly. We're running a little bit late. These are some best practices you should keep in mind when you're thinking about the financing and your lender. It's always best to identify your lender and your investor at the point of your application submittal, and that's because you're going to be required to get conditional commitment letters from both of them to provide in that application. It also puts you in a place where if the market starts to move, you may at least be able to look back to those lenders and investors and ask them to hold their pricing. Doesn't always work, but you've got a better chance if you've got them identified and you've gotten commitments from them. Because interest rate risk is something you really can't do anything about. These transactions are floating rate transactions, typically tied to LIBOR. So LIBOR plus a spread and then some cushion in there. They move around, and so there's a risk that your interest rate, both during construction and for your permanent, is going to be different, because as you've seen, it takes sometimes 3 years to get the thing to construction loan closing. Your tax credit pricing risk, similar kind of thing. You'll get a letter, and that's what you put in your application. I will tell you that pricing changes. And I will also tell you, beware that not every investor will hold that pricing. It's very much market driven. And when we had the tax changes, tax credit pricing went through the floor because large corporate investors didn't need the same amount of credits. These deals are probably higher leverage than what you'd see in the market rate world. You can actually get a loan to cost that's up to 85%. We'll go up to 90%. The perm loan sizing with a 1.15 DCR, that's not the same level of coverage you'd expect if you didn't have all those other sources. And most importantly, the stack and the way the capital is deployed. During construction, what you're going to see is, well, the investor, it's a push and pull. The investor is going to want to put in the smallest amount. The lender is going to want to see the largest amount. And so you're going to try to come up with something that makes both sides happy and preserves the yield that the investor underwrote in the first place. That's a really quick, I know, but we can answer questions later. I want to turn this over, and if you'll advance the slide, please. Bob Bente is going to talk about those investor motivations.
Hi, everyone. The first thing you want to think about with the investors is, why are they coming into this business? And some, like the banks, are forced into it by regulatory pressures. And many, though, are just looking at a good return. 7% after-tax yield right now is so much better than anything else you can find in the market. And that's just the fact of life. So as long as the yields don't change a lot, you can pretty well count on your investor coming in with some attractive pricing, which, high 80s, low 90s. California, you have a very low risk of default. I think the risks, I've seen numbers as low as 10 basis points for affordable housing projects in California. Because we're so underbuilt and there's so much demand, as I tell people, I don't have market risk when I put a project on the street. It's going to be leased up in 30 days at the most. The investor LP has a limited partner, and that's the tax credit investor. They have a lot of concerns because they're equity, and equity is the first thing to get hit when the project starts to go bad. But they also have the concerns about compliance, and this is huge. Steve Pontel is going to cover this later on, but you really can't stress the compliance issues enough for an investor. One is the failure to get the fully leased property within 12 months after C of O. If you don't make it in 1 year, you then get thrown out of the 10-year program and thrown into a 15-year program, which reduces the number of tax credits you get and the cash coming in. And construction costs can really can become overrun. And once they get overrun, who's going to come up with the money? Well, you hope your developer has it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to cover it all. So frequently the investor limited partner has to advance more funds. This is in the form of a partnership note. Next slide, please. So right now, the preferences for investors are really new construction. One reason is the fact that the state of California is not putting much of a premium on acquisition rehab projects or resyndication projects. They are focusing almost entirely on new construction or projects that are faced with an expiring regulatory agreement. New construction has a couple of other things going for it. One, it's less unknowns. When you're doing an acquisition rehab, once you start taking out the walls and looking to see what's really behind the walls, your costs can go through the roof. The developer likes acquisition rehab because they get paid more developer fee at loan closing, but the investor is again not going to be real excited about AC rehab. So the other thing is that the investors are going to focus more on the development team. They're going to want to know that the developer, the consultants, the general contractor all have experience, and the management team all have a property management team, all have experience with affordable housing. This is a huge point for most tax credit investors. The other thing you need to thinking about is that their concern really has to do with, in the construction side, with if the developer and the general contractor don't pay attention to timing and construction cost overruns, they can break a project. If you don't get your project started within 180 days of getting your tax credit award. If you don't get it built, then within 24 months after that, bad things happen. And you know, as a tax credit investor, it hits your pocketbook faster than it hits anybody else's. As Mo mentioned earlier, pro forma commercial projects are just not considered. You show a pro forma to an investor and it has commercial rent and expenses and net rents, they're just going to throw it out because it's just too risky. And even though you underwrite to a 10 or 15% vacancy factor, they really just don't want to deal with it right now. So you want to stay away from commercial properties and understanding that cities want to have street level retail, they want to have mixed use. It's very nice, it's very sexy, but with affordable housing right now in California, it just does not work. Pricing is driven by a number of factors, but one of them, of course, is the comparable yield. If an investor can find a better yield, they're going to go to it. The other issue right now is that if you remember the tax cuts in 2019, they crushed a lot of deals. Most tax credit investors held their pricing. Many didn't. A project that we had, our pricing was at 99 cents, dropped down to 92 cents. And we had to scramble at the last minute to find the funds to fill the gap. So the investor comes in at the very end of the deal. They're kind of the cherry on top of this wedding cake. And if you get the right investor with the right project, it's going to be a success. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Mo. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Bob. I think Bob touched upon this readiness category here. There's a readiness requirement even before that. Most of the funding programs that we've described to you today emphasize readiness and therefore require that we have all discretionary approvals in hand. So we're going through the community outreach that David Grunwald described earlier. We're going through the Planning Commission and Council meetings. And as you've heard also, it's an unknown whether you're going to get your allocation or not. Some affordable housing developers do close on lands and take a risk 3 to 4 years, whether the funding is going to be there or the funding is going to change and have a project approved in a certain way. And if the funding complies, bottom line, the longer it takes to get approvals, the less chance that this project shall get allocated. Additionally, what the tax credit allocating agencies and tax exempt bond allocating agencies have now pushed readiness to, saying, I need you to be 180 days ready to start construction with building permits in hand, with construction funding closed from when you receive an allocation. I'll start with a simple example. Imagine I just step into any of the cities and say, here, I have 6 months to process my plans to get building permits. Remember that I have to go to my construction lender and my tax credit investor that has to do a cost review at least 60 days before we close. Now it's 4 months. Furthermore, because of the highly competitive level and unknown nature, whether we're going to get an allocation or not, most of us do not start our working drawings before we know we're going to get an allocation. So all of a sudden, I need 3 to 4 months to complete my working drawings. I need 6 months to process them with the city and get building permits. I need a couple more months to bid them. And I also need 60 days to give the lender and investor the chance to review my costs and agree with me. I'm not sure how I can fit 12 months in 180 days, but that's what we're supposed to do. And that can only be done when we collaborate and work closely with the cities. But do understand that that is one of the stress tests that is required. You don't meet it, you lose the allocation and everything you've invested, both the city's time as well as the developer's time. The 9% tax credits, which we distinguish from the 4%, have a separate federal requirement that you need to place them within service, meaning for the purpose intended, a temporary certificate of occupancy or a certificate of occupancy within 2 calendar years of the calendar year within which you received the allocation. So that makes those drivers very critical. In general, the drivers are critical because obviously you don't have that on the tax exempt 4% side, but there's interest carry, there's interest lease up carry. And the one thing to remember with these projects is that when we receive an allocation, and we've been applying to all these funding programs, these amounts are fixed. This is not like a market rate situation where, hey, the market is hot, rents went up, you can offset. We don't have any sources to offset. These are issued and allocated based on costs 2 to 3 years backwards. Last but not least, unfortunately, most of the time, this is not a problem. As one of my speakers mentioned earlier, is that we lease them up fairly quickly because of demand, but nobody predicted COVID. And lo and behold, despite the incredible demand for senior housing, our challenge in COVID was not construction or construction materials or any of the other challenges, but in our senior communities, 100% affordable, the seniors were worried and scared about moving because of their health. The seniors were helping other family members within their family that lost their income to help them, with other things. And here we are, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, affordable demand for seniors took a long time to lease up. Just highlighting the unknowns that the affordable housing developer gets. A pro forma that we showed 3-4 years ago, as all of us in this business know, is a mere projection, and a lot changes. Thank you. I think this one next.
Okay.
Steve.
We're going to turn it over to Steve Pontel, who is going to take it home and then cover bending the cost curve.
Great. So thank you all. And I know you're all sitting there going, wow, this is exciting stuff. We should do more of it. And just to put the icing on the cake, as was mentioned before, the primary reason most market rate developers don't do affordable housing is because of the compliance side of the equation. And so when you think about that, every source of funding has its own reporting requirements, its own audit requirements, and our compliance department, in order to be able to manage when you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, 12 different sources of funding in one development, the compliance requirements for that development are off the chart, and they're expensive and they're not funded. And so when you think about what it takes to actually comply with all the funding sources, we'll leave it to your imagination to consider that. So I'm not going to go into the details on that, but we would ask cities to be very careful about any additional compliance requirements you put on a particular development. We're facing that right now in a number of cities. But if you can go to the next slide, because this is really the meat of the conversation for today. And it falls under the category of, okay, so what? So what do we do? What can we do? And this is where it comes in. There are two halves of this equation. One side of the equation is the sources of revenue, but the other side of the equation is the cost to get things done. And cities have the ability to influence costs dramatically. And one of the things that I'll often say is if a city wants something to happen, it's amazing what a city can do to make something happen. If a city wants a Costco or a Walmart or an Amazon headquarters or fill in the blank, cities can be very positive partners in thinking through solutions to problems in order to be able to get things done. What we believe is those same opportunities exist for those cities that really want affordable housing, that really want to partner in coming up with solutions. And let me put it in a couple of major categories and what Mo is just alluding to. The first part is the entitlement/environmental category. If a city were to say, here's a piece of land that we think is right for affordable housing, and if a city were to take that piece of land through the entitlement process, and if a city were to get the environmental clearances in place, and then approach developers about, we have a fully entitled, environmentally approved piece of property for affordable housing, you have saved us years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in process and risk associated with being able to get something done. And so it's not, enough to just say, here's a piece of land, you take it and you figure it out. But here's a piece of land, we've modeled it, we know how it scores, we've taken care of the entitlement, we have organized the neighborhood, we have public support behind the development, and we've taken it through the environmental process so you have a clean EIR. That would be a huge value add that cities are as well, if not much better equipped than we often are to be able to do the same thing. The second category would be the coordination facilitation part. And so at the end of the day, one of the things to think about is all the other agencies within your area that also have a say about what's happening on that piece of property. And so if the city were to take the lead in facilitating the conversations with special districts, other agencies, the utility companies, and I don't know how many of you recall during the old economic development days when we had red teams. If a city were to pull together a red team and they were to come to us and say, here's a piece of property, and we have a team of people representing all the appropriate agencies that are ready to go to make this happen, same thing. The cost savings and the increased uncertainty would be dramatic. And so when you think about the role a city can play without having to, with spending staff time, absolutely, and political capital, absolutely, then those are ways to significantly bend the cost curve. The other opportunities that exist is to think about, okay, what are the mitigations that we're requiring on this piece of property? Because as Mo said earlier, this is just math. This is all basic math. We know how much money people make. We know how much they can pay in rent. We know what it costs to build things. We know what the cost of mitigations are. And so one of the things that we often encourage cities to do is know the cost. Know the cost of any of the off-site mitigations, any of the on-site mitigations, and help us figure out ways to resolve these costs. You know, the average stormwater retention on any development we do is somewhere around $800,000. Is there a better way to do it than retaining water on a site that may or may not be maintained for the life of the development? And so, I mean, you can just begin to think about things that can be done. And then when you get into fees, the same thing is let's be reasonable and realistic about what are the fees that this particular development can afford. And cities can facilitate conversations, and I'll just use school districts as an example, and really talk about, especially school districts with declining enrollment, about, okay, you get paid ADA. Is it more beneficial to actually generate attendance for you as a result of this development? And how can a school district be a partner in this conversation? And school districts are great also because they can dispose of land for affordable housing without going through the normal school district land disposition process. And school districts are increasingly being required to help with quote unquote, homeless students, of which we have about 150,000 unstably housed public school students in the state of California. And so beginning to think about, you know, what can we do to make it a reasonable expectation so we can know the costs and how can we allocate those costs? And with that's offsite mitigations and fees, also with regard to design requirements for different cities, understand the cost of not only each additional design request and requirement put on the development, but the additional time for architects to redesign and redesign and redesign. Marv's Place, and I hesitate to share this, but Marv's Place, the property you just saw in Pasadena, went through 7 different design review committee revisions before we finally got approval. Each one of those revisions cost tens of thousands of dollars in order to be able to move it along. And so understanding what the cost of process, the cost of time, the cost of on-site mitigations, design, off-site mitigations, those are all ways that cities can dramatically participate in bending the cost curve in order for us to be able to move things forward. And then one final point is the city to begin to think about who are the natural partners, both to become advocates as well to potentially partner in getting the development done. And so we encourage building partnerships with the healthcare community. Increasingly, the health and housing connection is strongly being reinforced. And so bringing them to the table, the faith community, we and other developers have done numerous developments with the faith community and finding land and advocacy along those lines. The business community in town, whose biggest challenge is attracting and retaining employees, the possibility of getting businesses to partner and making it a development that actually includes specific workforce housing for specific businesses. But cities can help us convene those additional interest groups in order to make developments happen. So we look forward to your questions and we look forward to your partnership as we go forward. Thank you, Charmaine.
Okay, this final slide is all of us who have participated today on this panel and our contact information. And you can feel free to reach out to us. We would be happy to be contacted by you and answer questions individually if you have them. There is one question in the Q&A box right now, and I'll just go ahead and read it. are there any unique considerations that economically disadvantaged communities should consider, especially when even market rents appear to be at or slightly above the 60% AMI range? So if you're in a community that is quote unquote disadvantaged, are there some special considerations? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I'll address it. This is Steve again. So there are two halves of the equation. You know, we didn't even get into affirmatively furthering fair housing and opportunity neighborhoods, which is a high priority for most of the funding sources right now, is to build affordable housing in those communities that have, that are the best neighborhoods in town. That the other side of the argument is the fact that affordable housing can be catalytic for neighborhood transformation. And so the opportunity, and where we've actually had some significant success, is developing an affordable housing development in a challenged neighborhood where we then actually exert influence on surrounding properties owners to start taking care of their properties. And one of the biggest things that you get with an affordable housing development is very high quality management. And at the end of the day, the quality of the development directly correlates to the quality of the management. And so what I'm advocating is there's a positive opportunity in neighborhoods that are more challenged to use affordable housing as a catalyst for change, and to begin to deal with the fact that most people have their housing needs met by poor quality housing or overcrowding. And so to begin to address those neighborhoods where median incomes are low with high quality housing alternatives can really be transformative. I have no idea if I answered your question.
This is Mo. I'd like to add one much lower level. I mean, Stephen gave an excellent overall view, but when we come to the 60% issue and the concerns, and the fact that this business has so many checks and balances and reviewed by the state agencies, allocating agencies, by lenders and investors. If there is, and there has been cases where the market rents are at or slightly above or slightly below the 60% rent, all of the underwriting has to be by market study, 10% or lower. The state agencies, even though you're allowed to charge 60%, will not allow you to perform at that rent, neither with your lender nor your investor. So we're automatically at 10% below underwriting, just as an FYI.
Okay, I think at this point I need to turn it back over to Gilbert